part of leadership is process, but part of leadership is relationship. I lean in on leadership by relationship. One of my biggest leadership mantras is leadership by walking around. Like, you better be walking around and talking to people and developing those relationships, not sitting in your office and just working on the next memo or the next email or whatever, because of course there's a part of leadership that is process, and we'll never get away from that. But those relationships that you build is where the magic really happens, in my opinion, and certainly in my career field as a diplomat.
Welcome to the Long Blue Leadership Podcast, presented by the U.S. Air Force Academy Association and Foundation. These are powerful conversations with United States Air Force Academy graduates who have lived their lives with distinction. All leaders of character who candidly share their stories, including their best and worst moments, the challenges they've overcome, the people and events that have shaped who they are, and who willingly lend their wisdom to advance your leadership journey. Your host for this edition of Long Blue Leadership is Dr. Doug Lindsay, USAFA Class of '92, speaker, author, leadership consultant, and currently serving the Center for Character and Leadership Development as Executive Director of the Journal of Character and Leadership Development. And now, Dr. Doug Lindsay.
My guest today is Major Austin McKinney, a 2010 graduate of the Air Force Academy and now a Foreign Service Officer with the State Department. During his time as a cadet, he rose to the top of his graduating class as valedictorian and had earned a Marshall Scholarship to study economics in London. He has served as an acquisition officer and remains in the Air Force as a reservist. He also holds an MBA from the Harvard Business School, and presently he serves as a U.S. State Department Foreign Service Officer, and in that role has traveled to the Middle East, South America, and currently resides in Canada, where he's joining us from today. Major McKinney, thank you for being here on Long Blue Leadership Podcast.
Doug, thanks for having me. I'm so honored to be here.
Great to have you. One of the things we like to start out with is a little bit about our journey. We know leadership is a journey. So would you mind kind of starting back at the beginning and talking a little bit about your background, how you were raised, kind of your life pre-academy?
Definitely. Yeah. And thanks again for having me on the show. I'm an avid listener and subscriber to the show, so honored to be a part of it. So I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan. I grew up in a family of three boys. I was the oldest, and my dad was an Air Force officer, a KC-10 pilot, that then when he left active duty, he became a commercial airline pilot and started flying for Northwest and then Delta Airlines. So that's why we lived in Detroit. My mom was a public school teacher. So I say all that to say that I come from a family where public service was always part of our ethos. My dad, as I mentioned, was an Air Force officer. My grandfather was actually an Air Force officer as well. He started his career in the Air Force as an enlisted radio operator, went to OTS, and then became an officer in the Air Force for a full career, 28 years. And before that, his father, my great-grandfather, was an enlisted soldier in the U.S. Army during World War I. So couple generations of military service. Several of my dad's brothers also served in the Air Force. It's been a big part of our family story. So I grew up thinking about the Air Force. I didn't grow up with my dad in active duty or even really in the reserves. He was done with that when I was still very young, but I was familiar with the Air Force. And more importantly, I was motivated by public service. I love being part of an intense community. I love serving others. I love working as a team. These are all things that were part of my family's culture, part of my high school's culture, where we played sports, community service, things like all the normal stuff. But as I was growing older and I was transitioning to high school, I kept thinking about the Air Force. No one in my family had gone to the academy, and I had never even been there myself. But my dad had a couple friends that had attended the academy that I had met growing up and heard their stories, and it sounded like a really incredible place. I had that frame of reference for my family that put the Air Force on my radar. But then I really dug in and decided the academy was one of the best places for me to go. So that's what led to my application there, and where a little bit more about where I'm coming from.
That's great. So continuing on in the family business and then thinking about public service seemed like a great way to fuse those two together in terms of where you were thinking about college. Was there any other places that were on the radar that were kind of in competition, or was that kind of the place that you're like, that's where I need to be?
So I'll add one third factor, which is have some fun. So the other places I was looking at were closer to home. University of Michigan, Michigan State University. Those were sort of the two solid places that good students and exciting young people in Michigan look to go to. I also applied to West Point. I was fortunate enough to get accepted into the 4 places, but really I was really focused on the academy, and specifically the Air Force Academy. And really, once I got that letter, I was all in. So it didn't take much of a decision process. It was just true in my gut. It's where I wanted to go, and I wanted to have some fun. The Air Force Academy brings unrivaled opportunities to do things as a young person that you simply cannot have elsewhere. I knew that if I went to University of Michigan or Michigan State, while they're great places and bring a slew of great opportunities, I was going to get to do something different and have an adventure. So you combine that with the family history, the desire for public service, and to have some fun and have an adventure, the academy was the perfect place for me.
When you entered the academy, did you kind of have a vision of what that might look like in the Air Force, or was it just open to the opportunity, it kind of aligned, and then we'll kind of figure it out on the way? I'm just curious if you had a vector in mind of what you want to do when you were here, or did it just kind of develop during your time?
I think I was more open. As I mentioned, my dad was a pilot. I never had the pilot bug. I was open to the opportunity or the idea of it, but I wasn't a person that was very passionate about aviation from a young age. I wanted to explore that interest. I did some light flying lessons in high school and did some of the aviation programs at the academy, but I was more open. I didn't know a lot about the different career fields other than pilot because that was what my window into the Air Force through my dad had taught me about. So I had a lot of learning to do at the academy. But while I came in as an open-minded cadet, I think I started to form some of my goals pretty early on. Just through, the people that you meet, the opportunities that you have. I learned quickly about opportunities to go to graduate school after the academy, which got me really interested and motivated. I also decided pretty soon I wanted to be a management major through some of the leaders that I had met and the opportunities the department brought. And that taught me more about the acquisitions career field, which is where I landed. So I would say within probably the first semester of the academy, those were the way that I saw myself growing inside the Air Force, was first going to grad school and later being an acquisitions officer. So came in open-minded, but started developing some plans quickly.
Yeah, and it sounds like that kind of being open-minded helped a little bit, because I think we both, through our experiences, had classmates that we had that really had a very kind of singular focus.
Definitely.
And when sometimes that focus got off, or they weren't able to do that, and then they spent a lot of time trying to figure out what does that really look like. So maybe that openness to the experience and what would happen, but also a drive to figure that out served you well when you were a cadet, right?
It definitely kept things more flexible for me. There were multiple goals that I was trying to shoot for, and I wasn't like all eggs in one basket. On the flip side, some of the cadets that I knew that were more singular-minded in aviation or something else, it helps keep them clearly motivated, right? Like they had a very particular goal, and that's good in certain situations too. In my case, I had a handful of goals and was able to sort of work in different parts of the academy and different parts of the team out there, my classmates, the instructors, the AOCs, everyone, to sort of try to go after them all at the same time, knowing that if I didn't reach all of them, it was going to be okay too.
And like you had mentioned, there's just a plethora of opportunities that are there really to just really kind of figure out what you want to do. Were there certain people maybe that were impactful to you on that journey, or certain experiences that were really kind of pivotal moments for you as you kind of navigated your way through the 4 years?
Yeah. So in terms of pivotal people, I will say, my freshman year roommates, Steve Renner and Spencer Chardine, were absolutely essential in my development as a cadet. They were super sharp guys, athletically fit. They had the whole package kind of going on as a cadet, and I wanted to be like them. So they kept me on the straight and narrow and kept me motivated to do well at the academy. As I moved along, I kind of got really interested very quickly in the international affairs opportunities that the academy had. So I remember walking into Spanish class first semester of my 3-degree year, and Dr. Jean Lalou, who I think is still an instructor in Spanish out at the academy, was just, she went cold turkey. We were only allowed to speak Spanish in the classroom, which for me was like, a change of world. I had always, tried and, wasn't doing that well in Spanish, but I really liked it. And boom, in her class, it was Spanish only. If you want to talk in English, you can walk outside and go to another class. And so she really laid the marker down, which got me motivated, got me, studying the books and practicing a lot more hardcore than I was before. And that opened up a whole new path of opportunities at the academy that I got really excited about. So as I mentioned, international affairs kind of became my thing. Through the language department, through the political science department, I started participating in some extra opportunities. The first for me was a summer study abroad program in Spain, where I was putting my language skills to the test every day and interacting, with regular folks on the street in Spain and trying to do better. I followed that up with a semester abroad in Mexico at a civilian university, which really, immersed me in an environment where I had to participate in high-level classes, math and business classes in Spanish, and make friends, have a social life, all in a smaller town in Mexico where there wasn't a ton of people who spoke English. So that kept me down this path of getting excited about international affairs, using my language skills to interact with people. And then when I was going towards being a 2-degree university, I had a couple other opportunities through the political science department. I did a political and economics summer abroad program in the Czech Republic, where we were studying sort of the after effects of the Soviet Union and a lot of the countries that made up the old Eastern Bloc, like the Czech Republic, and how they could use more American-style political and economic models to bring themselves up by their bootstraps. And so that was the last of my international affairs type programs at the academy. But as I was moving through the academic experience, I saw myself as someone who wanted to participate in international security, international policy, international economics. That's what I was getting excited about. And I mean, I can't imagine another place other than the academy where I would have had so many opportunities to participate in something like that at such a young age. I mean, it was just truly such a special place.
And would you say those opportunities that you took advantage of, right? Because you still, they're competitive, and so you still got to, do the work to get to those. How did that shape your kind of worldview, do you think, at a very, developmental time, right? And at the academy, how did that shape your worldview or your thoughts about leadership or, those types of things in terms of how you wanted to serve after the academy?
Yeah. So one thing I think that the academy is very special in helping to shape your worldview is a lot of us come to as cadets, haven't had a lot of successes in high school, right? And along the way, you don't get to the academy unless you're really doing very well. And really, in many respects, you're an all-star when you get to the academy. But once you're there, you're going to face real challenges. And so for many of us, myself included, it was the first time in life that I had really struggled with different things. For me, one thing that I was, joke about, but in a serious way, is the physical fitness part of the academy, specifically the cardio fitness part, the run, was really killer on me. I hadn't done a lot of long distance running in high school. I was a football player and wrestler, and we didn't do any long distance running. So when I got to do that 1.5-mile run in basic training at the Air Force Academy for the first time at that altitude, I failed, and I wasn't even close to passing, and I felt like I was going to die at the end. And so, that was you kind of laugh it off now, but in the moment, that was a big failure for me. I was like, wow, okay, I'm at risk of not being able to be a cadet anymore if I can't get this part of my performance better. And so it shaped my worldview in the sense that, one of my personal mottos is never accept the first no. And so when I had that first no for me at the academy, it was through the 1.5-mile run at altitude, which I failed, but I just chose not to accept that. I was going to practice. My roommate, Spencer Shard, I know I mentioned earlier, was a, elite state level champion cross country runner where he came from in Kentucky. And so he would get out there with me and run with me, and he would often be running backwards as I was running forward. He would just kind of motivate me to keep going. But that never accept the first no and start to lean on people around you became just a deeply held part of my view on leadership and on professionalism. And that the academy gave me that. I didn't learn that in high school.
Do you think it was critical that happened to you early on in your experience? Because we know when people kind of hit that wall, sometimes it can be immediately, sometimes it can be sophomore year, junior year, some maybe not even until their senior year. But how critical do you think that was to you developmentally?
No, I think it was critical for my path, just to be reminded about the really what's at play, but also like your own inherent need to rely on others. I think a lot of people arrive to the academy very confident in their ability to get things done for good reasons because they have done so far. But the academy is going to teach you, and I'm glad it taught me early on, that you need other people. And this is not a solo mission. This is a team sport. And so when I had that initial failure and I was able to rely on my roommate and others around me to quickly get up to speed, I never failed another run again, but I didn't love them. But, I never failed another one. But I had that lesson internalized. And then right away, whether it was academics or whether it was learning contrails or whether it was, marching on a silver weekend with my classmates, I knew that I wasn't on my own, and I wasn't going to succeed on my own. It was all about working with my teammates and leadership to get done a collective mission. So I'm glad I learned it early.
No, it's good because I think you hit on those components, right? So as valedictorian, obviously the academics were a priority and you excelled really well on that. But I appreciate kind of that perspective of how the physical and the mental and the military and all those different aspects, how they all fit together to kind of round us out versus just trying to just focus solely on the academics, and then how you can bring around a team of folks to kind of help you and support you in that way.
100%. And for me, even though, I ended up doing very well academically at the academy, it also wasn't a solo mission. I was one of the biggest takers of EI, or extra instruction, that you would have ever met at the academy. I was in my instructors' offices all the time, talking about homework, preparing for GRs, working on projects with them and my teammates if it was a team project. But, I applied that lesson of I can't do this by myself. I tried to apply it in all aspects of the academy, and I think it was to my benefit.
And I appreciate you sharing that because I think it's pretty easy to sit back and go, oh, you're a valedictorian, so obviously that must have come really easy and all that. But to really hear that message of, getting the extra instruction, taking the time, being diligent, being thoughtful on that process, so that you were able to take advantage of that around there, so that kind of helped develop that aspect versus just thinking, oh, well, that must have come easy because you were the valedictorian. We know better than that, right?
Of course. And if you peel back the layer on any great achievement, there's always a bunch of people that were involved. I'm a true believer in that. And so, another factor on my academic journey at the academy, I was very lucky to be a part of the management department, I felt, because they supported me at several crucial junctures in my career at the academy that enabled me to get things done. A great example for me is that when I was asked if I wanted to participate in a semester abroad in Mexico, this was the first time the academy had ever done the program. There was a lot that was unclear about the academics that were available there, which classes, those sort of things. And I talked with the leadership of the management there, and they said, look, we'll support you. We'll get it done. If we don't have all the answers today, we'll get them next couple of days. But you need to do this. It's good for your development. It's good for the academy. Go do it, and we support you. And so at various times in my academic journey specifically, the people around me were there to support me. And so you can't get it done on your own.
Yeah, it's interesting because you talk a lot about kind of the political science part of things,
yeah,
but also being a management major. So was there some benefit to kind of having that fusion of perspectives and mindsets and background that served you in your career?
Yeah, so I always took the sort of wide core curriculum and generalist mindset at the academy pretty seriously, in the sense that I wanted to learn about different topics. I was excited to learn a little bit about engineering and science through the core curriculum, even though I didn't become a technical major. And while I was a management major, and business and economics are really what motivate me at my core, I was also excited to learn about political science, and I did, a couple extra classes in that department that were, and other departments. I remember I took an art history class through the English department when I was a cadet as one of my first year electives. And I remember more, I think I've got the textbook sitting over here in my library still. I learned more in that class and remember more of that from that specific class than many of my other classes at the academy. And it was because I thought, well, man, I don't know anything about art. It seems like it's something important part of the human experience. The academy had it on offer, so I took advantage of it and absolutely loved the class. So I tried to take advantage of the wide breadth of things available at the academy.
That kind of helps shape that perspective of the opportunity that exists out of the academy. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about maybe some of the leadership lessons that you took away from your experience at the academy. We'll jump into your kind of career in just a minute, but were there any kind of those lingering lessons that you learned about that? I mean, you talk about relying on others, you talk about never taking the first no.
Mm-hmm.
Just wondering if there were other things maybe related to character and leadership that you took away from your experience.
Yeah, one of the things that as a cadet, but I think I've only come, at least personally, to truly appreciate over time is that as a cadet, you learn quickly that your reputation for, especially for integrity, really matters. And it will define a lot about the way that you're able to lead, the way that you're able to work with others, and the way that they want to work with you. And we hear this repeatedly. It's the first core value, right? Integrity first. But another way to say that is that people's trust in you and their ability to rely on you to do the right thing is quintessential for achieving any great project, any great achievement. And I learned that at the academy. So your reputation matters, and specifically your other people's trust in you to do the right thing, and your integrity is at the core of anything that you will achieve great over the course of your life. And so I mentioned that, we learn this all the time as cadets. I don't think I came to truly understand how much it shaped my worldview and life until later. And I've been in different professional contexts since the academy, right? I was an Air Force officer. I've been in graduate school. I worked in the private sector briefly, and now I'm in the State Department, where I'm interacting with international officials from other countries all the time. And in multiple different instances, people have alluded to like, well, I can trust Austin, or like, Austin's going to do the right thing. Austin is not going to screw me over. And you learn that at the academy, but you don't fully conceptualize how fundamental it is until later. So I think that that's the most important thing that the academy taught me. And it was always right there, right? It was always the first core value. It just took me some time to understand how important it was.
Yeah, and I think we've gotten better at understanding, I think, that institutionally with the kind of leader of character framework and what we're trying to do with that, and trying to inculcate that earlier on in the experience. So instead of it just being maybe just organic from that you learn along the way, trying to be a little bit more intentional on those development of, lifting others and living honorably and elevating performance in that approach.
100%. And so, the program, there's always program changes at the academy, but that kernel of every cadet's experience about having integrity and interacting with others' integrity, can't say enough about it. I mean, it is the core of our experience and what makes us special as graduates of the Air Force Academy.
And it sounds like that experience that you went through and taking advantage of those opportunities, never taking the first no, relying on others, set you up, or at least prepared you for your career. Could you talk a little bit about that transition and what that was like, and then kind of your career path to get you to where you are today, and maybe lessons along the way?
Yeah, certainly. After the academy, I did a first round of graduate school in the United Kingdom. I studied economics at the London School of Economics. So it was sort of a continuing part of my academic journey. I also, because of where I was located, sort of right near the heart of Europe, I was able to continue my interest in international affairs, be a part of, attend think tank panel discussions, and travel and other ways to sort of beef up my knowledge of international security, international economics, in addition to my core studies as a graduate student. After that, I started as an acquisitions officer at Hanscom Air Force Base, where I was, traditional acquisitions program manager. I was working on radar upgrades. I was working on intelligence software systems, sort of the bread and butter acquisitions officer. It was great. Along the way, I did a few deployments while I was on active duty. First as an executive officer in Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, where I briefly forward deployed to Bagram, Afghanistan as well. Later on, I had the opportunity to deploy a series of times to Bogota, Colombia, and work out of the U.S. Embassy there, working on foreign military sales and military cooperation with the Colombian Air Force. It was a very meaningful experience to me, my first opportunity to work inside of an embassy through the Air Force, obviously, but as part of the embassy team. And so that advanced my interest in being a part of the U.S. international affairs system. After that, I also had the chance to deploy to Honduras, where I was working on a humanitarian assistance mission, where we were training with the Hondurans about how to respond to earthquakes, hurricanes, things like that. And that wrapped up my time in active duty. So I had, the experience of being an acquisitions officer, deploying overseas, and I really still had this international affairs bug that had been growing in me since my first semester at the academy. I left active duty, transitioned to the reserves. I stayed an acquisitions officer, and I've done a few assignments inside the reserves. I did business school because, as I mentioned, I'd always been, really most interested in business, economics, international economics. And that's where it took me right after active duty. I wasn't sure exactly where I was going to land, what I was going to do out of active duty. I had this passion for international affairs, but didn't know how I was going to apply it. So went to business school. I started working for a technology company called HubSpot afterwards. It's a software company, and they were growing their business and their market overseas. Specifically, they hired me because they were expanding quickly in Latin America, a place that I had a lot of experience after having lived in and worked in Mexico, Colombia, Honduras. So I was able to help that company get started and open their first official Latin American office, which was in Colombia, a place I knew very well. So as I was working in business, I was enjoying the experience, applying my skills, but I missed that public service, to bring it back to a little bit earlier in my conversation. It's part of my family ethos. It's part of who I am. And as I was working in business, I was having a good time, but I wasn't sure if for me, if I was going to be passionate about this for the long term. And I had some doubts. So I started looking for other ways to do public service, and I quickly landed on the State Department because I had worked in the embassy in Colombia. I knew foreign service officers of the State Department. I made the application, and that's where I landed. So a little over 5 years ago, I joined the State Department. I'm a foreign service officer. The sort of general way that people refer to us as diplomats. We represent the United States in other countries, usually out of embassies, and we work on international relations. So as a State Department officer, I have served in Mexico, Pakistan, and now Canada, and that's where I am today.
We oftentimes see people transition out of the service and not think about that reserve component or being able to continue to serve. Why was that an important part for you as you transitioned off active duty to kind of stay connected in that way, even though you had a lot of other things that were going on, a lot of other opportunities?
I am absolutely thrilled with my decision to have stayed in the reserves. At the time, I knew that I loved the Air Force. The Air Force is a big part of my family. Both of my brothers graduated from the academy after me, Connor and Lucas, class of 2013 and 2017. And so I knew I didn't want to walk away from the Air Force, even though I was leaving active duty. I stayed in the reserves and have done some incredible work, honestly, and being a part of great teams. I stayed on it working as an acquisitions officer, later working out of the Pentagon as an innovation-oriented officer. And so I've been able to keep that foot in the door with the Air Force and stay connected, work on the mission, work with my teammates. People, for example, I serve in a reserve unit now with one of the folks that I graduated from the academy with, who's also a reservist. So that network and that teamwork just continues. And so I always tell people, that are coming up towards the end of their active duty commitment or are thinking about getting out of active duty, I really encourage them to think about the reserves. It's a fairly light touch way to stay a part of the mission. And it doesn't control your life like it does when you're on active duty. And that when you're on active duty comes with a lot of sacrifice. When you're in the reserves, it's a lighter touch way, but you don't have to say, goodbye forever when you leave active duty. You stay in the reserves. You can sort of opt in to things that you want to do while you're doing your minimum service and stay connected. Another thing that I've done to try to stay connected to the academy is I serve on a Massachusetts Senators Air Force Academy nomination board. So I did business school at Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then I worked for a software company in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I started working with the senator back in 2016. Interviewing the high schoolers, helping them process their nomination applications. And for me, it's the best way to stay motivated to be the best version of myself is when you hear from a 17-year-old that's doing amazing things and has a smile on their face and wants to be a part of the long blue line. You take a look in the mirror after and say, okay, I need to step my game up too. Like this caliber of young person wants to be a part of the long blue line. What am I doing today and tomorrow to keep our name up and to keep doing great things? So those are some of the ways I've stayed connected to the Air Force through the reserves and through the nomination board. But honestly, it all goes back to I do love the Air Force. It's part of my family history. It's part of my history, and I want to keep participating.
No, that's great. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you're seeing from our young adults that are looking at the academy, right? I think there's a lot of information and misinformation in there about, looking at like generational differences and things that this generation is or this generation isn't. What have you taken away from that experience of interviewing potential future cadets for service in terms of what they bring to the table and the uniqueness, and do they seem different than when you were a cadet or when you were going through that process?
Yeah, obviously times change, certain parts of culture change, but, I think what I have seen is the common thread through, when I was a cadet, meeting older graduates, meeting young kids in high school. I think the common thread is the desire to serve, to protect the United States and the American people, and to be a part of something bigger than themselves, and a passion for service. That's the common thread. That doesn't change, I don't think. Some of the things that I have observed that, that are, I think, better for all of us. young people have an innate, knowledge and awareness of technology. It's just been a part of their life since they were young. They know how to use it. They know, what it's good for, what it's not, in a way that you and me and people before us just didn't have. And so, good example of this is I interviewed a high school student named Andrew Cormier at the time, this was a few years back, who had a great interview and got selected to go to the academy. And he's now running a podcast as a cadet, as a 2 degree. Probably 5 years after I interviewed him. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, he's a 2 degree running a podcast show? I would have had no idea how to leverage the technology to put all, the business plan together to deploy, all these resources. And he's doing it, and he's crushing it. He's doing well. And that familiarity with technology is just such a plus to the Air Force and such a plus to our nation that we bring that knowledge and talent into the Air Force. Something else I've noticed about young people is, and this is a little bit more of a challenge, but I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just different, which is, we have to do a little bit more to convince them about, why the Air Force is for them. Like they might have more questions than we did when we were young, but that's okay. Questioning things is about as American as you can get, right? Like, we love to question things. That's the American spirit. And it doesn't mean that they aren't patriotic, or it doesn't mean that they, don't want to be part of the mission, but we have to do our part to convince them that it's something worth their time and something worth doing. So that's some of the differences that I've noticed.
No, I appreciate that, because I think it has an impact on how we think about and engage folks moving forward. I think the core of the academy is always going to be the core of the academy, but as we look at those opportunities and those ways to connect and what those experiences look like, are important for us to kind of present those. Because seems to me a common theme kind of throughout your career was just kind of keeping your options open and being open to the opportunities that are presented in front of you, and not just kind of being a passive consumer of the experience, but actively engaging in that and then taking the most out of that. Because I think everybody's experience and path through the academy, but also through their careers, is going to be different, and we don't know what's going to resonate. But it seems like that openness that you brought to your experience has served you really well, whether it be management, political science, the opportunities to study abroad, the foreign language, the cultural immersion, the willingness to move around. All of that just creates kind of a learning mindset, I think, that is very critical, I think, to being just a leader, but also a good citizen as well, right?
Yeah. And, whenever a young person asks, something along the lines of like, why should I join the military? Why should I go to a service academy? I just pivot to my own life story. I'm like, look at all these incredible things that I got to do that there's no way I could have done without the Air Force Academy and without the Air Force. I credit most of the great things in my life are somewhere drawn back to, being a part of the Air Force Academy, many of the great things. And so, I think, at the basic level, 20, 30, however many years ago, no one would have questioned like, well, why should I choose to go to the Air Force Academy or something like that? I think it was implicit, like why wouldn't you, right? But I think today's generation knows that they have many options and is very familiar through media and through the stories of older veterans about the level of sacrifice entailed in being a military officer. And that all starts by going to the academy. And so they have some questions, they have some doubts. We have to be comfortable with, making them feel more attracted to the academy, right? And for me, that's been about just using my life story and the opportunities that I've had. And usually young kids light up when I tell them about like all the different things that I've got to do. And they're like, hey, maybe that sounds like a place I want to go. And yeah, we just have to keep convincing them.
Leadership is just storytelling, right? It's about being able to do that, not having to try to convince them necessarily, but just letting them know what they may not know about the opportunities. And so I think every one of these stories is important, because I think it's going to resonate with people, different people, depending upon where they're coming from, right?
Definitely. Another thing I picked up at the academy and afterward, sort of the counterpart of never accept the first no. Another one of my life mottos is always be ready to say yes. At the academy, I did things that I never expected or planned, but I said yes. Do you want to study abroad for the first program ever in Mexico? Yes. Do you want to participate in cadet soaring program? Yes. Do you want to, take this squadron military leadership position? Yes. I'm always ready to say yes. And that's been really important later on in my career too. Now, I'm a diplomat, right? And so my whole job is to connect with people, especially leading figures and officials in other countries, and try to explain the U.S. Point of view and try to convince them to work with us. I try to convince them to hopefully not do things that would be counter to U.S. and global interests, right? And part of a very important part of being a diplomat is being ready to say yes, because my whole job is based upon having a trusted relationship with other people. If they invite you to dinner, out of nowhere and you say no, guess what? You're not going to have that relationship anymore. If they say, hey, do you want to do this conference with our team, or do you want to participate in this interview with this journalist? You better be ready to say yes, because they want to know that you want to participate. And so through being ready to say yes, I'm able to build that social capital, build that social trust that allows me to be an effective representative of the U.S. because I have these closer knit relationships with people, because I was just ready to say yes. When often people, we all are busy, or we might be nervous about change, or we might, be afraid of the future. So there's always a reason to say no. But if you're ready to say yes, you don't know where it could take you.
Yeah, I think it's an important perspective, because if we start from yes, it doesn't mean we're going to say yes to everything,
No.
but at least it opens a possibility that there could be some opportunity there, versus if we start with no, then we are trying to convince ourselves on why we should, versus the other way around. So it seems like a subtle difference, but it's actually pretty monumental as we think about just development in general, right? As people, as leaders, just that being open to that potential.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you underline that, and that's why I always say be ready to say yes. It's not necessarily saying yes every time, but I think in the Air Force, at the academy, whether you're in the squadron or later on active duty, we all know people that say no to everything, right? And if a new idea is proposed or a new way of doing things, they're going to complain, and they're going to say it's not going to work in a million years, and those people get pretty tiring to be around, and they can drag others down, right? And they can get in the way of achieving the mission, right? We all know people like that. And I never wanted to be like that. I wanted to be someone to say, all right, well, let's think about it. Or, okay, have you considered this? Or, all right, let's try it out. Let's be ready to say yes together and move forward as a team. Because if you just always start from a default of no, you're really not going to get much done.
No, you're not. And I think if we all look at regardless of domain, whether you look at it in business, the military, academic, sports, whatever, I can't think of a single leader that's an exemplar in their field that has that let's start with no perspective,
Nope.
right? There's always that, they're always like leaning toward the next opportunity and understanding what that is. Again, not saying yes to everything, that would be reckless, but really being open to the possibility of what that could bring and what that is. And maybe we don't say yes to that, but it helps shape our thinking toward the next opportunity that we have, right?
History books are not filled with people who only said no in their career. That doesn't leave you with much of a legacy or much of an impact. History books are filled with inventors and political leaders and artists and religious figures that were willing to try something new and achieve something great with other people by being ready to say yes. If you're always saying no, you're not going to leave much of an impact.
No, you're not. And I would say that, 9 times out of 10 with those leaders, there are failures to those yeses sometimes that then spur them to the next one, right? So it doesn't just automatically assume that we're going to have this wild success. There's got to be those failures, but the 2 step forward, 1 step back is still a step gained overall, right? So that opportunity to kind of see what that's going to help us with moving forward. I want to spend a little time thinking about, so you've done some work with the Middle East and South America, Canada. What has that been like in terms of climbing inside another culture, seeing where they're at? And there's obviously differences across those different cultures. And what if you could talk about maybe some of the similarities that you've seen across those different domains? Because I think we oftentimes discussions turn around division and difference and trying to really focus on that. But what are maybe some of the things you've learned about looking at those different cultures and operating within them that's helped you as a leader?
Yeah, I mean, As you were asking me this question, the first thing that popped in my head is just the under the surface similarities that we all have. I've lived and worked in many, many countries at this point, and I can say that everybody cares about their family, everybody cares about having a purpose, everybody wants to have a sense of security, and to know that the future is going to be better than the present or the past. That's just human nature. And it doesn't matter what language you speak. It doesn't matter the color of your skin. It doesn't matter the history of your country. We all want those things. And so, we tend to, as humans, focus on our superficial differences rather than the, sort of the below the surface core similarities that we have. I've learned that more about myself over time as well. I would say that, more operationally speaking, some of my experiences as a diplomat, but also in multiple deployments with the Air Force as well, in international contexts, I've become a much better listener than I used to be. I think, in classic military culture and a lot of the personalities that might be drawn to the academy, and I can certainly say for myself, I would usually in the past have led with speaking. I have an idea, I have an opinion, and I want you to share my opinion, right? As a diplomat, you're often, you represent the U.S., so the person that you're interacting with probably already knows what the U.S. thinks about something, right? Like, they watch our news media, they listen to our politicians, they watch our movies, they kind of know how we think. But the reverse isn't always true, right? Like, when I'm in Pakistan, for example, there's quite a gap between what I know about their country and what they know about my country. I lead with listening a lot more than I used to, because they're there to try to tell you something. And if you don't give them the chance and the space, both the emotional and the physical space and also the trust space, you're not going to hear that critical piece of information, which is the whole point of the meeting or the whole point of the interview or the whole point of the engagement. So as I've gone from cross-cultural experiences, one or the other, I've spent a lot of time in the Americas, also in the Middle East as well. I have found that what helps me be effective is listening actively. I have a speaking role too, but then deciphering what that means, right? Like, being that hinge point between wherever I am and the people back in Washington, or the people back in, the Pentagon, or people back at base, wherever they are in the U.S., and translating, what is this person really trying to say? They may have said these words, but what they really meant was this. They may have asked for that, but what they really need is this. And you don't get that without listening. You have to start with just active listening.
Yeah, I mean, it plucks my behavioral science heartstrings a little bit, right? Because it's that people dynamic, right? So I was a behavioral science major at the academy, and one of the things that resonated with me was much like economics and the political side with you, is that people dynamic, that listening. People have a message. People want to be heard. They want to have, feel like that value proposition is there. So yeah, it's interesting to hear the how similar that is across the domains, but that it's oftentimes easy to talk instead of listen, and how we all kind of learn to flip that around a little bit more in our experiences, regardless of our domain.
I'll give you a fun story from Pakistan when I was there serving. This is just a personal story, but I had a meeting with like the equivalent of a deputy undersecretary with one of their cabinet, one of their departments, and in the meeting, I thought it was going awfully, and he seemed very upset about the topic that we were talking about. Without getting into too in the weeds of the details, but he was basically seemed very upset about the U.S. position and what we had proposed, and was giving me some very strong feedback about it. All right, so great. Left the meeting. I sort of cabled that back to Washington, and I thought, wow, well, that just really did not go well. And I thought he was personally sort of upset about it. A week or two later, I saw him, pure happenstance, at a cafe. He comes over smiling, shakes my hand, gives me a pat on the back. We're talking. I said, hey, are you still upset about that one thing? And he goes, oh, I had to tell you that. Didn't you see I was reading off like a piece of paper? That's our formal position. But what I really need you to do is this other thing, and we can work together. It's not about what's on the paper. It's about what we need to do in this other space. And so, I was listening really well in the moment and I was taking notes in that original meeting, but I didn't get the full context. I didn't see that he was reading off a piece of paper. Someone said, you got to read this to the Americans, and then we'll just all move on together. And so you got to be aware of the verbals, the nonverbals, the human interaction, right? Like if you would have asked me, you going to see this guy next week? What's it going to be like? I was like, oh man, I hope I don't see him ever again. But it turns out we still had a great relationship. It was just, he was communicating to me in a different way. And you got to be aware of all the surroundings.
That's a great example. But, I would say there's probably something about how you showed up in that receptiveness that made him feel like he could come up afterward.
I hope so.
And give you that hug and do that, right? Because otherwise, I think it would have been easy for him to stay away. And I think that's just a great lesson on leadership as well, that ability to kind of read between the lines of not what just is being said, but what's not being said and how it's being said. And some of that is just taking the time to do that. When I was deployed in Afghanistan, there was common experience for those that went to Iraq as well as, it's like this joke about, drinking a lot of tea, but it's not about the tea,
no.
Right? It's about the time. It's about the presence. It's about the willingness to just kind of sit there and be in that moment without having to always be on and narrating and doing that, but just to kind of, sit there and pause in that to create that boundary. And I think, when we're high achievers, we always think about the doing instead of the sitting and the listening and the understanding that goes along with that you've kind of highlighted.
Yeah. And I think that part of leadership is process, but part of leadership is relationship. And I'm a big, I lean in on the leadership by relationship part, right? Like I always laughed at one of my biggest leadership mantras is Colin Powell's leadership by walking around. Like you better be walking around and talking to people and developing those relationships, not sitting in your office and just working on the next memo or the next email or whatever, because of course there's a part of leadership that is process and we'll never get away from that. But those relationships that you build is where the magic really happens, in my opinion, and certainly in my career field as a diplomat.
That changes a bit as we grow as well, right? I think very early on as we're trying to learn our skill, learn our trade, there is a lot of that kind of over focus on the process. I want to be very good at what I do, right? I want to understand and be an expert. And then I think at some point in our careers, we realize that there's a shift there, and that being an expert at what you do only gets you into the room, right? It's like the ticket for admission, but it's the other stuff that you're talking about that really allows for success and allows you to really kind of, build those teams and lead people.
I'm laughing because we have this old saying in the State Department that is junior officers take jobs based upon the location, right? Like, oh, I want to be in Paris or I want to be in Fiji or whatever it is. Junior officers take jobs based on location. Mid-level officers take jobs based upon the job itself, like whatever, maybe a prestigious supervisory position or like a really technically important role somewhere. But that senior people take jobs based upon who they're working with. So it goes from location to job to really what it really counts is who you're working with. And so that trust that you've developed over time, working with the diverse team and knowing, your own strengths, your own weaknesses, how you can complement with others. That's what senior strategic leaders do. It's all in the people-to-people space.
That's why what you'll find is those successful leaders have such vast networks they can tap into because they've understood the value of, even though they were in that process side, to build those networks, to build those relationships, to stay connected. It's very rare to find someone who's a successful senior leader and they just don't seem to know anybody, right? It's actually quite the opposite when you talk to them and say, oh, I know so-and-so, I'll make that introduction, or I'll let you know, or I'll introduce you, because they've realized that as they've grown up in the process that those relationships are really what make things happen. That
is one of the most valuable things that a senior ranking person can give to you is their willingness to leverage their network and make an introduction, right? Like it's that one email or that one phone call or that one praise, and you hope it's not that one criticism, but that can make the difference for you being able to get something done and leverage those very senior people. It just makes such a difference. In my personal world, and again, I sort of business person as well. I always talk about I have a personal board of advisors, right? So companies have boards of advisors that sort of guide the company with external perspective, people who've had success in other fields, and that can apply that to the company at hand, saying, have you thought about this, or you should do that, or if you make this decision, this might happen. So I have, I think everyone should have their own personal board of advisors. And on mine, I've got, my wife and my close family members and stuff like that. But I've also got, courtesy of the academy, some really top-notch friends that were classmates of mine at the academy, are still some of my best friends to this day. And when I'm facing a tough decision or something that I regret or something that I'm afraid of, professionally or personally, I will seek out my personal board of advisors on the phone, over text, FaceTime, whatever it is. They know me, right? We've known each other for a long time, and that trust, and they're able to help tell me what I'm not thinking about, or show me a part of myself that I might not be, so at the fore, but they know is really happening, that may be blocking me or maybe preventing me or maybe forcing me to think about something one way or the other. And so that personal board of advisors, when we're talking about a relationship, is another big thing. And I'm always recommending that people develop. Teamwork doesn't stop after the academy. It should just keep going.
To your point, there's a vulnerability in that aspect of being able to go to people that you trust and to develop that trust with them, and they trust who you are and that feedback that they're going to give, that, hey, maybe I don't know everything in this situation, and being open enough, comfortable enough with our own development and our own leadership to go, boy, I want to seek someone else's perspective to see. But there's an inherent developmental vulnerability that I think is necessary as we continue to grow, or we just stop at some point and then we just have less value to add to the team.
And you just can't. You're never going to be able to do it alone. And to earlier in our conversation, the academy faces you with tremendous challenges, and for most people, failures early on. And for me at least, you learn that, you internalize that. You can't do it alone. You have to work with others, friends, family, teammates. You're just not going to get somewhere great on your own. You have to go through others.
There's the saying that it's lonely at the top, but that doesn't mean you're alone at the top, right? So I think a lot of people look at that first part and don't realize that it's through those networks, it's through those communities. And that could be from a professional standpoint. And I know people have that and I do as well, on the personal side as well, that give me advice as a person, not so much about for the career side of things, but other things that are important to me as well. So I think it's important to have that. I like that idea of kind of that board of advisors.
And there's a flip side to it. You have a responsibility to be on other people's board of advisors, right? And so as an individual, someone is coming to you with an important question or asking for advice, like, stop what you're doing. Like, put the email down, put your cell phone down for an hour, talk to them about what's really going on. Because if you're only asking from others and you're not delivering for them as well, it's sort of the equation is out of balance, right? And so, a person who you've had on the show and talked a little bit about this was my close friend, Nate Dial, classmate of mine from 2010. He's a quintessential example, right? If you go to Nate Dial with a problem, he's going to give you his time. He's going to give you his best reflection. He's going to give you his top-notch recommendation. And, he'll give you the 60, 90, 120 minutes to focus on it. And he's going to be there, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually. You got him, right? We all know people that if you try to catch them to collaborate on a project or ask them about something, they're just like, they barely look up from their computer. Or they say like, oh, let's connect in a week or two, and then you never hear from them again. Like, that's not how this works. It's a two-way relationship. And so if you want to have a personal board of advisors, you better be ready to be a board member for someone else.
And I think it's powerful from not only from a development and a leadership standpoint, just as a humanity standpoint, to be connected and being involved and invested in other people's lives, that we can kind of give that back instead of just being in that receive. It kind of goes back to your point about being listening, right? Not always about, sometimes we got to do the talking, but sometimes we can do the listening as well. And it's a balance of those two that come together.
You find similar dynamics in a mentor-mentee relationship. It's a two-way relationship, and it always has to be. Otherwise, it just won't be successful.
Yeah, and kind of along those lines, you've had a lot of different experience in different domains and at different levels and interacting with people at different levels of leadership. What do you see as maybe a couple of things that people really struggle with, or that leaders are struggling with? And again, you've kind of alluded to some of that with, maybe doing more talking than listening, not understanding the value of team. But do you see some common themes across those that where you see leaders often struggle?
One thing that I've seen, I'm still very much in the mid-career part of my journey, right? I am not a strategic leader yet. I try to exhibit leadership wherever I can, but I'm not an enterprise leader. One thing I have observed, though, as people make that journey to being a strategic or enterprise leader, is that Some folks have a hard time letting go and delegating effectively. Some people, as they get up into the senior mid ranks or the lower senior ranks, they're still trying to act like an action officer. They're still spending most of their time on tactical level things that is really not the purview of a senior leader anymore. Your purview as a senior leader is to train, equip, and empower those below you to get the tactics and operational level done so that you focus on the bigger picture. And I think that some people have a hard time with that. And like the gap between a good mid-level manager and excellent enterprise leader it involves a level of letting go that many people, high-performing people, are not comfortable with, right? They have spent decades of their life doing most activities really well as an individual or as a leader of a small team. And then when you become an enterprise leader, it's a different ballgame. You're not going to know a lot of the people, and you're not going to work with every day a lot of the people underneath you. But your role is then to set the structure, set the vision, and let go and let the people, flourish underneath you, right? And so where I've seen some leaders struggle is they keep that tactical or action officer mindset for too long. You have to let go, trust in others, and set the foundation to be a successful strategic leader. Enterprise leaders aren't spending their time correcting, memos or talking about schedules. They're spending their time thinking about how they're going to move an enterprise mission forward and set it up for success in the future years, right? Like that's what a good strategic leader does. So that's something that I've noticed along the way.
No, I appreciate that. And do you think that leaders, and I've seen that as well, they struggle from that? Is that because, is that a selection issue? Is that a developmental issue? Is it a maturation issue? Is it an identity issue of how a person sees himself? What do you think is a driver with that challenge?
So I think it's a mind shift switch that's difficult at the personal level. So this is, I think about it in the way that we had a class on this at Harvard Business School. And if you look at a person's career over time, the skills that you are rewarded for in the early parts of your career are not necessarily the same skills that you will be rewarded for in the senior part of your career, right? So let's just take a business example of a consultant, right? A junior consultant is rewarded monetarily and through their performance reviews and everything for doing the important low-level work of developing presentations, of developing meetings, of putting forth the message of the consulting company, right? As you grow and you want to become a senior leader in a consulting company, you are rewarded for developing strategic relationships, finding new clients, selling more to those clients, knowing which clients to let go of because they're too difficult or too much of a burden on the organization. And those are really different skills, right? Like knowing which problematic client to cut off after a year or 2 or 3 of a positive relationship is a very different skill than building a very technical 50 slide PowerPoint about a specific business problem. And so as you're moving up, you should be constantly asking yourself, what am I going to be rewarded for in this particular role? And it's probably going to be different than what you were doing 3 or 5 years ago. But it takes that shift of mindset. And a lot of people, I think if they're not purposeful about it, will just keep doing what they were rewarded for before, because it got them to where they are, right? Like that's a good skill too. But you have to recognize that the situation has changed and you need to develop and deploy a different set of skills in this new role. That's sort of how we learned about it in business school.
Having that board of advisors can help you with that as well. So we don't get so locked into our own process that we're not taking a look around in terms of doing that. So having some trusted advisors and mentors to help us with that can be helpful. As well.
Yeah, and you learn about this at the academy too, right? You were taught at the academy that when you get out in the Air Force as an officer, you want to have trusted senior enlisted folks that can tell you the truth and that aren't afraid to tell you what's really going on and how your decisions or how your leadership actions are being perceived, right? And if you don't have that trusted relationship with you, they're not going to tell you, and you're not going to be an effective leader. As a result, you'll be blind as a leader. So whether it's the people, the senior enlisted when you're a junior Air Force officer, whether if you're a business leader and you have, department managers underneath you, or whether it's your own family and you're talking about with your brother, for example, you need to have those people that are not afraid to tell you what's really going on and can help you course correct.
Kind of on that idea of leadership, any leadership lessons or tips or thoughts or things that you'd like to leave with our listeners? We covered a lot of ground today, but anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I mean, just as a quick recap, some of my core leadership messages have always been don't accept the first no, and always be ready to say yes. Be ready to work with others, and you can't do it alone. Those are sort of my guiding North Stars, so to speak. If I had any final message, maybe not so related to leadership, but just to the special community that we have, whether you're a cadet at the academy, you just graduated, or you graduated 50 years ago, we're part of a special community. Be there for each other, do things together, socially, professionally, in the Air Force, in business, in your community. We have a group of people that are top-notch, that trust each other, and we can achieve great things together. And so some of the funnest things in life, that I've been a part of after the academy have been with other graduates. So that senator nomination board that I mentioned earlier, I do it with 2 other Air Force Academy grads, and we have a blast every year doing it. Some of my closest friends in Washington, where I live when I'm not overseas, it's because we're having barbecues with Academy grads on Saturdays, and that's my form of having fun. So we're part of a special community, and always be contributing to it is what I would encourage us all to think about it. It doesn't have to always be hyper formally or professionally, but there's always something that we can do for this community, and it's something that is truly special. So we should take advantage of it.
No, I appreciate that, and I appreciate what you do for the community as well. And I want to thank you for taking the time today to talk with us on the Long Blue Leadership Podcast.
My pleasure, Doug. Great to have met you and chatted with you, and I'm grateful to have been on the podcast. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for listening to Long Blue Leadership. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe, share it with your family and friends, and post it to your social channels. Long Blue Leadership is a production of the Long Blue Line Podcast Network and presented by the U.S. Air Force Academy Association and Foundation. The views and opinions of the guests and hosts do not necessarily reflect those of the United States Air Force, Air Force Academy, Academy Association and Foundation, its staff, or management. The podcast drops every 2 weeks on Tuesday mornings. Subscribe to Long Blue Leadership on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn plus Alexa, and all your favorite podcast platforms. Search @Air Force Grads on LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and more for show announcements and updates. And visit longblueleadership.org for past episodes and more Long Blue Line Podcast Network programming.